A lot of data here, and we're going to be moving through stuff pretty quickly. If at any time you have questions, please ask. This is not a presentation that you have to wait until the end. So please stop me, please ask. Let's go into it deeper. The whole goal here is that I provide you something of value that will help you be more effective either as a candidate or as a campaign or as somebody who in some capacity or agency is going to be working with voters, okay? 2020 is going to be a very big, huge, monumental election. And I know we say that about every election. This is the most important one. But if current trends are anything, and if the data about the voters are anything, it literally will be a monumental election. The 2018 spike that we had was the largest spike since 1940. So we're talking 80 years, right? 78 years, the largest spike in 78 years. Political involvement and engagement has now crept into all facets of our life, but less than half of the people are voting. So we need to change that. This presentation was designed to be sent to you later, so if you just want to email me, and I'll show you my email address in just a little bit. The reason I'm going to show you my email address is because I'm afraid that if I sent a clipboard around and you wrote it down, maybe I might mix up an I for an L or something like that, right? And I don't want to make maybe a 0 for an O. I don't want to make that mistake. So I think it might be easier if you send me the email and then I'll share it with you. We are not going to go through all of the presentation because the end of it is just a series of resources for you as a candidate or campaign to go through at your own time, okay? And I have up here a list of books that at the end, if maybe you guys would like to go through and take a look at them. We've got Efficacy of Tactics, all about yard signs, who puts them up, the polarization of our country. This was actually my wife's advisor at Avery University. Messaging, what works and what doesn't work on policy issues, how emotion affects voting. This academic, who is also a friend of my wife's, is all about women running for office. And yes, disclaimer right now, I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone this, sexism is real and exists. There's a huge irony here, though. The media is horrible in their representation of women running for office. But the truth is, at the congressional levels and below, women actually perform just as well as men and slightly more advantageous in certain offices. The problem is all this negativity sometimes makes women feel like they don't want to run in the first place. So this is all about, we need to change that. We need to let women know, yes, it's like you have an extra barrier that you've got to deal with, but if you can just deal with it and ignore the media, you can win and you will win. Oh, here you go, sir. All right. So with that said, okay, I hate icebreakers. I do apologize. If anybody in here feels like me, I really do apologize. But please humor me. If I can just have everyone stand up real quick, please. Trust me, it'll be so worth it. And now I need everyone to take one giant step to your right. Every single person complied. Congratulations, you're just like voters. You can go ahead and have a seat. Yeah, I just mobilized you to action, okay? Look, at the end of the day, peer pressure affects behavior. And what we're doing here, this icebreaker, is a very public and visible act. So even if you don't feel like it, even if you're like me and you hate icebreakers, the truth is you are going to conform to those around you. Plus, we support our team. Hopefully, all of us in this room are Democrats or lean Democrat. And we also support authority figures, even though some of you do know me, and perhaps some of you know me, but maybe not that well, and there's probably a handful who don't know me at all. The fact that I am up here leading this presentation makes me a quasi-authority figure. And what we know about human behavior is if I ask you to do something, you are very likely to do it. And in fact, this is very much what Trump's base does or what Abrams' base does. You know, if she says go out and early vote, Oh, hey, come on in. But more importantly, when we talk about authority figures, we're talking about head of households. We're talking about pastors, right? We're talking about community leaders. If those individuals say they are going to vote and you should too, then the people who follow them are much more likely to do so. Here you go, sir. So, we also are willing to follow even if we personally disagree. There will be folks out there who vote Republican who do not disagree with, who do not agree with the abortion issue, but their parents vote Republican or their pastor votes Republican, so guess what they do as well? They vote Republican, and vice versa for Democrats. In fact, one time when I was out canvassing, I met this young graduate couple. Man was white, she was African American, they were pregnant, they were living off of his salary, his stipend up at UGA, and they were unsure about health care, and they had a whole host of issues they were concerned about. They agreed with Democrats literally on every issue except for the abortion issue. They were Catholic, and that was just the line for them. And her folks, if I remember correctly, her folks were, no, you cannot vote, pro-choice. So because of her folks, they voted Republican as well. Authority figures are very hard to break away from, but you can use that to your advantage. So a little bit about me. I am a trained social scientist. I do have my own consulting company. I have been a campaign manager for special election and a general election. But beyond that, I have actually helped with, over the last several years, I've actually helped with several mayoral races. I also worked for Kelly Gertz, some city commission races. I helped with Vita Thornton's race, Board of Education races, State House races. I consulted on 3 congressional races, including the 6th and 7th. And for me, this picture here actually illustrates how I feel about the current state of politics right now. It does feel a little bit like a dumpster fire floating down a river that also happens to be a detour. So put it all together, and for me, that's what it feels like. And maybe it does for you as well. But I hope that you're all here in this room right now because you want to change that. And we can. We can change it. I know that it's easy to get down. It is. Everybody does it. Even the happiest people. I'm sure Adam at some point in time feels down. I've never seen it, but I'm sure it happens. But have faith. We can change this. Today, we're going to be spending the bulk of our time on field strategy. Votebuilder is a tool. And if you don't understand field strategy, Votebuilder's not going to do you any good. Plus, there probably could be some races, I imagine. Maybe they don't use Votebuilder. So we're going to be focusing on field strategy. And right off the bat, I'm going to start with something that many of you may not like. And that is hearing that campaigns, there's no evidence that we actually persuade anybody. There's zero evidence that all the work and money and time and resources that campaigns put out actually win over anybody. In fact, there was an analysis of over 49 separate experiments. 49 separate experiments. And in none of those did they find any evidence that these campaigns and candidates are winning folks over. However, and this is the huge caveat, campaigns can make a big difference in low turnout races. So like Board of Education races, but Board of Education races are also nonpartisan, and campaigns can make a huge difference in nonpartisan races. And campaigns can make a huge difference on mobilization of voters. So, throughout this presentation today, what I'm going to be trying to hammer home to you, and many of you may already know this, I apologize, but you're going to get it again. This needs to be about mobilization, not persuasion. So the effectiveness of campaigns lies in one simple truth, and that is turning out the vote, mobilizing people to vote. Look, voters have already decided. In fact, what the research tells us is months up to a year in advance of the actual election, voters have already made up their minds. They know which team they support, which candidate they like, and that's not going to change. What will change is how they feel about voting. Some people might be pumped and ready and excited to vote. Others, they're just done with the negativity. They just feel like their vote doesn't matter, their voice doesn't matter, Democrats keep losing, why show up? And that's what your campaign needs to change. So it's not persuasion, it's getting people to realize that they need to show up.
Okay, you said we can talk.
Yeah, go ahead.
What about in local elections where people don't necessarily know the candidates?
Yep. Glad you brought that up. We are going to get to that. So that's a nonpartisan and a low turnout race.
Okay.
And campaigns make a huge difference there. And what we're going to get to a little bit later is that even in these nonpartisan races, people actually want to know which side you're on. And that changes how they feel about the election. So if Jon Snow is running for Board of Education, but I don't know if he's a Democrat or Republican, I don't know if I want to go in and vote for him. You know, maybe I like some of his ideas, but even if I like some of his ideas, if I find out he's Republican, as a voter, I'm not going to vote for him. So in instances like that, yes, actually the campaign letting people know this is where we stand and who we are makes a big difference. All right, so we're going to talk about field strategy here, okay? There is a simple view of field strategy that I want you to walk away with, and that's one, you need to understand the electorate. So we're talking about the voters. You need to identify and target the right voters, because there are going to be people out there who are indeed voters, they're just not going to vote for you. And we don't want to engage them. And then you need to employ your strategy. How are you going to mobilize them? Now, why are we taking this simplistic look? Because each district race is unique. There are things that all of them have in common. But the truth is, at the end of the day, the presidential is vastly different than the congressional, which is vastly different than the state house or state senate, which is vastly different than mayor, commissioner, board of education, right? So you are going to use national and state data about U.S. voters, and then you're going to apply that to your own race. And it may have to vary a little bit. Who you target, how you target them, may have to shift a little bit than other folks in this room. And we understand that because each race is different. But at the end of the day, we still want you to know that you need to identify and target your voters, allocate your resources effectively and efficiently. Don't be wasting time or money. You can't get that back. And I'm taking a picture here. Go ahead. I'm going to share it, but go ahead.
I know. I just don't want to forget this.
And you need to mobilize those voters. Again, I'm going to say this ad nauseum. Your path to victory lies in mobilization. Okay? How mobilization can affect elections. As I stated earlier here to somebody that showed up early, I'm from Kansas. I hate to admit it, but I am. There's nothing I miss about Kansas. But I lived there during this time period, 1998. So in 1998, the Kansas State Board of Education voted in a conservative majority. Evolution was dropped from the science standards across the state. 2 years later, they voted in moderates. And wouldn't you know it, evolution was reinstated. 2 years after that, there was actually a split between conservatives and moderates. Nothing really happened. But in 2004, conservatives regained a majority, okay? Once they regained the majority, evolution was dropped from the science standards again, and this time intelligent design was introduced. Well, 2006, moderates regained majority. I bet you can probably guess what's going to happen here. But intelligent design was repealed from the standards. 2013, moderates and liberals gained a supermajority, and wouldn't you know it, evolution and climate change were put into the standards. I would just like to point out, we're talking about a 15-year time span, and we're talking about multiple elections, right? So are you trying to tell me that the voters were changing their minds, how they felt about these issues? Or is it more likely that Board of Education races are low turnout races? That's what I'm saying it is. And I'm saying that what probably happened, and actually we know this happened, but there were certain campaigns that throughout each of these different elections were just more effective at nabbing a couple extra people. And that made all the difference to them. So this is the perfect example that I like to use about how mobilization can make a big difference. Again, another truth bomb, and I hate to put this on you, but conventional wisdom is failing Democrats. If Democrats were doing everything right, then how would we explain this? The fact that the majority of legislators by party are Republican, the fact that most of legislative controlled by party is Republican, and that the majority of states that have Republican control, we're talking both branches of the General Assembly, right, the Senate and the House, are held by Republicans. How do we explain that if Democrats are doing it right? And this has increased sharply over the last several years, last 15, 20 years. And I know that you could argue, well, it's gerrymandering, right? We will get to that in a second. In 1990, there were 29 states where both branches of the government were controlled by Democrats. Only six were controlled by Republicans, both branches. Fast forward to today, and the number of states with Democratic control has been cut in half, 14, and there's almost 4 times as many Republican states where there's total control by the Republican Party. Yes, gerrymandering is a symptom, okay? But you need to win first in order to redraw the maps. And I'd like to point out, Democrats are actually guilty of gerrymandering as well. If you look at Maryland and California, Democrats gerrymander to their advantage. So we can't sit here and kick the can down the road and say, oh, it's all gerrymandering. No, we've allowed that to happen. We've allowed Republicans to get into office to gerrymander, and we need to fix this. So, voters in the 2018 midterms, and we're going to talk about this because this is so super important leading up to the 2020 races. They literally only cared about 2 things: the party behind the candidate's name and anti-Trump, even though he wasn't on the ticket. He was that powerful in affecting people to show up as a referendum against him or in support of him. The 2018 results had very little to do with, and I know there's going to be a lot of people that cringe at this, but characteristics of local congressional candidates, who represented their district, incumbency, liberal or conservative ideology. This is an interesting caveat. Straying too far to the left or right, being super conservative or super progressive, didn't hurt votes for candidates. An analysis of all 2016-2018 elections shows no measurable advantage for actually taking strong ideological positions, right or left. I guess as you're facing me, right or left. So what should Democratic campaigns be doing? Positive. Like, this is so weird, but the Democratic voters, and you have to remember, sitting in this room, you are not who we are talking about. You are not the general electorate, okay? You are highly engaged, highly informative people, politically engaged, and that is not the most people. That is not the majority. Democratic voters do not like negativity, but negativity helps Republicans. That's why you see all these attack ads and these scary. Fear works for Republicans. It doesn't work for Democrats. This means no attack odds on your opponent. And if you have a primary opponent as a Democrat, do not go negative. That hurts you a lot. Mobilize voters. Worry less about swing voters and persuasion, and everything must be personal. So we're talking canvassing, door-to-door, face-to-face conversations. We're talking to somebody on the phone and having a real-life, in-person conversation. This means handwritten notes, handwritten postcards. Everything needs to be personal. When you are again, this is just me, I hate it at the presidential debates when they're like, oh, I met Joe the plumber, and they're giving a personal story. That's me, but I don't represent the electorate. The electorate loves that stuff. They love these personal stories. And you need to think of your campaign like Facebook. You need engagement, okay? Just saying, hey, we need to show up and vote doesn't work. You need to get people talking and sharing that information and becoming your volunteers. So why might Democrats be reluctant to change? And we do need to go over this because for many of us, in the back of our minds, maybe you're still a little skeptical right now, or maybe you're thinking, well, okay, this all seems pretty simple, because it is, so why aren't we doing this? If you've been in this business for 20 or 30 years, you don't want to admit that your practices are ineffective now. And I do want to point out, look, if there's anybody in this room who has been a part of campaigns prior, it's not that you were necessarily wrong then, it's that if you continue it now, you are, okay? Anecdotes may convince individuals that they are right, and we see this all the time. We will see people say, but my neighbor is voting Democrat, and he used to be a Republican. I believe you, but that's not the majority of individuals, and we really, really should only be concerned about the majority of individuals. Also, tradition. We are eventually going to talk about yard signs, and I hate that topic. I hate that topic Because there are people who have very strong feelings, and the fact that several people in this room made some type of vocalization, it just shows you that people are like, oh, yards, we're going there, are we? Yes, we will. But it's emotion, right? Tradition. So hey, I'm going to give you a little thing about yard signs right now. Yard signs are actually something that are part of a person's identity. And as campaigns, we've been looking at them wrong. We tend to think of yard signs as like, we need them to win over votes. Yard signs are to help your base feel better. They want that because it's their identity. And it's tradition. I come from a yard sign family or something, okay? Now, we do need to discuss the caveats between primaries and generals. Some of you may be on a campaign where you end up in a primary. So if you're in that situation, again, stay positive. But ironically, the Democrats are not really the party of tolerance. So even though we support all these policy issues, these social policy issues that are for tolerance, the Democratic voters themselves aren't. In fact, when it comes to female candidates in a Democratic primary, the voters want to see gendered stereotypes. They do. They punish a female candidate for not following body posture and gestures that are stereotypically feminine. The voters punish the female candidates for even having things like masculine colors. So you need to follow gendered stereotypes, as much as I hate to say that. And the primary is where you want to have policy and you want to be different from your opponent. I'm going to do this is what I propose, this is how we're going to pay for it. Because in a primary, those voters want that information.
Jared.
Oh, Jared.
Thanks, Avery.
Come on in. Here, stay right there for 1 second. There you go, sir. Thank you. All right. The primary and general voters are different, okay? Again, stay positive. I can't stress that enough. That's why I got it up there like 3 times, once on the slide before, twice here. But at the congressional level and below, this is what I was talking about. This is just one example of the research. There's a lot of research on this. Women win at the same rates, and in certain races, they actually have a slightly higher win percentage than men. Now, here's the caveat, okay? I told you about all this sexist media, which we know. I mean, we can measure that as well. The problem is, one of the reasons why women win at higher rates is because since there's so much sexism in the media, and since there's so much negativity towards women, it actually weeds out female candidates, which means that only the strongest survive. So typically what we see is we actually have stronger female candidates as a whole, okay, we're talking as a whole, than male candidates, because men don't face that same type of discrimination, which is why these stronger female candidates are actually more likely to win. So that raises their win rates. Now is not the time for policy. This is the general. People have already decided they're going to support you. You're a Democrat. What are they going to do? Vote for the Republican? They're not going to vote for the Republican. They're going to vote for you because you've got a Democrat behind your name. They don't care about the policy. And if anybody is standing up going, but what about this policy? They're probably a voter from the primary, okay? Like, they're going to vote for you anyway. You need to focus on emotion, change, and engagement. So, I know I said I hate anecdotes. I'm going to show you one anyway. Because I believe in big picture data, using small examples to show it in action. So, for those who don't know, this is House District 117. It has 4 different parts of 4 different counties. 3 of them are Republican, heavily Republican, Jackson, Barrow, and Oconee, only Clarke being the Democratic-leaning part of that district, okay? To give you an idea of how it fits into Athens, it's basically a portion of the center west, and then this is all rural area. Yes, to be fair, this area is lightly or sparsely densely populated. This area is the most densely populated. About 55% or so of people are in this area. So about half inside, about half outside. Okay, I was the campaign manager for Georgia HD 117 in 2018. We were outnumbered by Republicans almost 2 to 1. I should reword that. The ratio was 3 to 2. So it was a 3 to 2 ratio. They still outnumbered us. The district was newly gerrymandered in 2010, no surprise, as were a lot of districts, including former Representative Wallace's 119 back there. And 2018 would be the first contested election between a Democrat and Republican in that Georgia House district. I also want to point out that right here, this in 2016, the state turnout was 76%. It's a presidential year. It makes sense. Presidential years are always higher. But in 2018, the turnout dropped 15% to 61%. So, there are a couple of things that I would like to point out in addition, because it could affect some of you. Taller candidates usually win. The truth is, 90% of the time. Don't look at the screen. Don't look at the next part. Our candidate was under 5 foot. First name on the ballot receives a 10% bump in vote share. This is across the country. Our candidate was the second name listed. Again, you know how I told you that Democratic voters are not the party of tolerance? They actually reward Asian candidates more than any other Democratic candidate. Asian Democratic candidates usually receive the highest vote share among Democrats, followed by white candidates, followed by black candidates, with Latino or Latino candidates getting the smallest vote share among Democratic candidates. I'm telling you, Democratic voters are picky and mean. Our candidate happened to be Latino as well. Our opponent had political family ties to the region and state, as well as ties to Kemp, who was running for governor. And our candidate was rather new to politics, having just won the 2017 special election. Our opponent outraised us in funding and spent more than we raised, with $91,000 left over. 90% of the time, it's actually like 91%, I think. 91% of the time, the campaigns or candidates that raise the most usually win. So look, we knew it was an uphill battle. We knew that. I would like to point out, so these are all precincts. The solid lines are Republican turnout percentages starting back in 2012. So 2012 to 2018. So the solid lines are Republican. The dotted lines are Democrat. We already knew, just looking at the data, that Republican voters turned out, and turned out in significant numbers. But I would like to bring your attention to these two precincts. These precincts right here are the two lowest performing Democratic precincts, and look what we managed to do. We took the second lowest precinct and made it the highest performing Democratic precinct, because we targeted those precincts and knew that we had to make a difference there. So a lot of our time, money, resources, volunteers, and canvassers were in those precincts. If we were going to win, we couldn't rely on these bottom precincts holding us back. We had to move them, and move them we did. Also, I'd like to compare us to how Hillary performed in 2016. I would like to point out that the number of votes she got versus the number of votes we got, we dropped less than 1%. Actually, Wallace, you outperformed Hillary. Republicans in our House, though, dropped. Remember that state average I told you, 76 to 61, 15%? That actually fit with the Republicans in our House. They also dropped about 15%. So we dropped less than 1%, they dropped 15%. Even though the Republican candidate won, and both 117 and 119, it was not unexpected. We knew it was going to be a tough uphill battle. However, we did show that there are certain practices and techniques that work to move people. Hopefully, I want to point out, we also laid the groundwork for future candidates. We are going to change this. So the point of showing the Georgia HG 117 race there was to show that, one, we specifically targeted underperforming precincts that we knew we needed to change the percent turnout in. And we raised turnout over the state average in these Democratic precincts. We outperformed Republicans by a significant margin. Yes, they still won. We knew they would, but we made one heck of a fight out of it.
We made them spend some money.
What's that?
We made them spend some money.
We made him spend some money. That is true. That is true. So right now I want to talk about the electorate, okay? How do voters see the election? At the end of the day, most voters are actually low information voters. And what we mean by this is that they don't really understand how policy works. They don't really understand everything on a candidate's platform. They couldn't even name everything on a candidate's platform. They just know you are on their side. Voting is an emotional act. Nobody goes, oh, you know what? That's a good point. I think I will show up and vote for that. Nobody does that. They vote because they're angry. They vote because they're scared. They vote because they are proud. They vote because it's a sense of civic duty. There is an emotional response to this, and that is what you need to trigger in the electorate that you are targeting. As much as we want logic and reason to matter, it usually doesn't. And for somebody like me who's very analytical, this kills me. It kills me. But I still have to take a step back and tell myself, it is what it is. It just simply is what it is. Voters look for cues, including party affiliation, and they vote based off of those cues. So this goes back to your question about like nonpartisan races. We actually know that when mailers go out in a nonpartisan race and the mailer says, I'm a Democrat, that makes a difference. So I'm big on analogies, you'll have to forgive me. Let's think of politics as football here for a second. So let's think of the voters as football fans, okay? And these candidates are their football teams. So these voters, these fans, they've got a team that they root for, a candidate that they root for. They check in a few times throughout the season to see how their team is doing. They look at Facebook or the news or whatever the case is. They watch the Super Bowl, which we'll call election night. They don't really watch other games. They don't know how other candidates are doing. Nobody here in Georgia knows what happened in the Utah, congressional races. Nobody knows. They can't really name many players, maybe the quarterback. My daughters only know Tom Brady because they were having an argument with their friends over who's the greatest football player. And my daughters get it from me. They want to be right. So they actually Googled and saw Tom Brady. But if it wasn't for that argument, they'd have no idea. And my daughter volunteers for the Young Dems and for our campaign too. So she's politically involved and she doesn't know what's going on. And I can't blame her because most voters don't either. And they can't really explain much football strategy. Or in this sense, they can't really explain, so Medicaid for all, what does that look like? How does it work? How would you implement it? Most candidates have a hard time doing that as well. Now, yes, you are going to have your fantasy football players out there who know everything and have all the stats down. I'm not even that good. I don't pretend to. I don't know. Those are going to be your primary voters. Those are going to be a lot of your volunteers. These are the people who show up and they're going to tell you as the candidate. They're going to tell you as the campaign manager. They're going to tell you, this is what you need to be doing. This is what works. I don't know. Maybe they're right. I'd have to hear what they're saying. But the truth is, they know they're right. The rest of them, though, the rest of them only want to see their team win. That's the only thing they care about at the end of the day. So, with all of this said, what position should you, as the candidate or the campaign, what position should you stake out? There's decades of research that political ignorance is the norm. Because of that, voters don't really punish candidates for being too bold. It would take a really extreme position, like abolishing ICE, to really kind of get people to maybe start questioning things. But what we do know about voters is they don't actually punish you for being a little bit too, I gotta think, to your right or to your left. However, there is some evidence that the more extreme you go, you actually mobilize the opposition, because the opposition goes, oh, wait a minute, that's socialist over there. I gotta put that socialist in check. How much we mobilize the opposition is debated. So that's just something that you, on a personal level, are going to have to kind of think about. The key takeaway is that centrism doesn't help, though. Just putting yourself in the middle and saying, I'm going to straddle the fence so I don't upset anybody, that doesn't help you. So if it doesn't help you, why are you doing it? You could run on a platform of rescuing dogs from a shelter, and Republicans will label you anti-cat. It doesn't matter what you do. They will find a way anyway to vilify you. So if that's the case, what are you worried about? I'm guilty of this. Some of you probably know. There is something called the backfire effect, and we've known this for a long time. When you try to convince somebody of what you know to be true, but that challenges their previously held beliefs or their assumptions, you aren't winning anyone over. In fact, you're making a stronger enemy. What we know from psychology is that if I try to convince you, so man, let's say that you are like an ardent supporter of like, you need 1 million yard signs, and I say, well, you don't really need that many. All I've done is convince her that I'm wrong and she's right. It's an attack on her personal identity, because having to admit that she might be wrong about something, that's a character flaw, and nobody wants to admit that. So when candidates and campaigns are out there, especially if you've got, Sir Martin, right? Okay, so sir, if you're at a forum and somebody asks you a question and they're like, well, what about this? This is what I heard. If you tell them, well, that's actually not right, all you're doing is actually turning that person into an enemy. Telling somebody that they're wrong doesn't help. And this is the weirdest thing of all. Putting yourself in their shoes, actually trying to see it from their perspective. Well, why would a Republican think that way? All that does, is actually reinforce your negative stereotypes about them. So when somebody says, all right, well, let's think of it the way that a Republican voter might. No, don't do that, because all it does is reinforce your negative stereotypes. Oh, here you go, ma'am. And it makes you guilty of reinforcing your disdain for them even more. So it's best to ignore the opposition. Don't try and put yourselves in their shoes. Don't try and correct them. Don't try and win them over. And you need to be delicate with your voters and your volunteers who try and tell you one thing when you know that that's not right. You can't just straight up say, that's wrong. So all of this leads us to this point. Being homogenous or a safe candidate, it does communicate something to the public. Remember, these are emotional voters, and they're looking for cues. If you are homogenous, if you are a centrist, you are really conveying to them the message of you're not really on their team. So it does make sense for conservatives to have conservative identities. Why are progressives doing the same thing? That makes no sense. So what's the problem here? Traditionally, Democrats like to play it safe. Conventional wisdom has led Democrats to wage persuasive campaigns aimed at winning over swing voters and independents. You are all probably very familiar with these types of campaigns or remember them from the 90s and the early 2000s. Candidates and campaigns traditionally have not wanted to say or do anything that might alienate voters. And that, in effect, has kept them from mobilizing their own. And that's the problem. When you try to play it safe, you're not energizing your voters. But the other side is energizing theirs. So, they're doing it all wrong today. There was a time where voters were moderate, and there was such a thing as a cross-party voter. That was from the 50s through the 70s. We actually have a lot of evidence of ticket splitting, and in some cases, it was up to half. Clearly, that time has passed. This is the most partisan electorate we've ever had since we've been keeping records of how people vote. So we're talking like 80 years. Why shouldn't we try to win over others? I'm hammering this point home because so many campaigns, especially in Georgia, they still think, well, it's a red state, we've got to win over. We have got to break away from that. So, one of the things is, well, look at Trump. There were Bernie supporters who, when he didn't make it, they just went to Trump because it was about the economy, and, well, that's bull. At the end of the day, voters, they just react at the gut level. They're reacting to their identities, and they want to protect them. If there were Democratic voters, which we know about 12 or 15% of Bernie supporters did vote for Trump, they weren't voting for the economy. What we actually know about them is they just didn't want Hillary to win. So they voted for Bernie in the primary, and then they voted for the guy in the general. They were protecting their identity, not voting for their team. The same voters who are not going to vote for an African-American male are probably not going to vote for any Democratic candidate. And voters who think that they're being inundated by violent immigrants, drug dealers and rapists, and the ones who feel that white men are victims now, these are not persuadable voters. Why are we trying to win them over? So everybody good? We'll stop in maybe like 15 minutes for a break. Is that okay? Okay. I just don't want to overdo it here. Okay. A picture is worth 1,000 words. And I'm going to point this out. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez versus the incumbent Joe Crowley, the fourth most powerful Dem in the congressional house, okay? I said earlier, being too bold or extreme doesn't hurt you. I think it's safe to say she's fairly bold, right? The conventional way versus the new tradition, or versus the new way. So that's why I chose this as an example. She had an ad. I don't know how many people saw it. She ran a little video. It was terrific video. But this is a still image. And for anyone who can't see, she's changing out her flats because she's going to work for her heels. I don't wear heels, but my wife years ago gave up on them. She said, no, I'm not wearing them. She said, the flats are comfortable. And she goes, I just need to be comfortable. My wife gets this. She saw this and she's like, oh yeah, I totally understand. And this was a perfect image. She's producing a visual. She's creating emotion. She's having people understand and connect with her, and she didn't have to say a thing. And when I said personal matters, so we've clocked all the activities that Ocasio-Cortez had. She had 110 canvassing events alone. 22 phone banking events, 33 rallies, 57 get out the votes, 58 petitioning and voter registration events. And in all that time, Joe Crowley had 8 events. Huge difference. This dude, Joe Crowley, had been in there for, I can't remember how many years, 20 years or something like that, and she was brand new. It would be easy to think that Ocasio-Cortez won because she's Latina in a Hispanic district. In fact, again, going back to the media and why we probably should just turn off our cell phones and delete our Facebook accounts. The Washington Post, he lost because of changing demographics. USA Today, it was changing demographics. New York Magazine, we can't look at it and say that what happened there can happen across the state. It's unique. New York Times, demographics. They couldn't explain it because it didn't fit with their pre-existing belief system about how elections work. And yes, 48% of that district is Hispanic. But I'm going to let you in on a secret. When we look at who voted, it wasn't actually Latino voters. She won with a majority of millennial whites. If demographics were all that mattered, she actually would have lost at the voter turnout rates that we saw. So we're spending time on this to make a point. The traditional way of doing things and saying things can be hard to break away from. The media cannot break away from it. Do not listen to them. Political opponents in the media are echoing wrong information to us. So it's no wonder that Democrats, especially Democratic voters, really struggle here, okay? So you can also see that most of her votes, the strongest vote support, they were not predominantly Hispanic. This goes back to what I said. She won with white millennials. What they did was that they identified voters, like I'm going to help you do today. You're going to learn to target voters, found local residents on social media, targeted them with digital ads. They made a potential voter aware of the campaign and then followed up with that targeted person with a face-to-face conversation, a canvasser, and then they worked hard, kind of like a pyramid scheme, to turn those contacts into volunteers, to get them to go do the same thing for them. They put in a lot of groundwork here. They buttressed door knocking with heavy digital, phone calling, and texting strategy. They targeted progressive voters in 5 different languages. It was not targeting Latinos. It was targeting everybody who was a millennial and likely to vote. So they built a multiracial progressive coalition of voters. They knew who they needed to target and they went after them. So why a new approach and focus on strategy matters? Because going back to Joe Crowley, the typical campaign strategy of incumbents like Crowley is to rely more on campaign consultants utilizing a strategy of persuasion. Hey, vote for me. I've been in office for 20 years. I know what's going on. That doesn't work. Most primary elections are not competitive. In fact, in that New York district, only 8% of registered voters turned out. 8%. She didn't need many. She just needed enough. The broad conclusion is that the more personal, the effective. I showed you that wheel chart there with all of her personalized events and activities and door knocking. She put in the work to make it personal, and it paid off. Authentic interaction with the door-to-door canvasser can actually increase turnout by 5 to 8, and another study says 9 percentage points. We're talking going from 47% to 55% just through canvassing. So I like this tweet. Maybe you've seen it. Respect the hustle. We won because we outworked the competition, period. That's true. She outworked Joe Crowley, and she won, and she deserved the win. You can do the same thing in your campaigns. It's going to be hard. I'm not going to lie to you. It's going to be hard. But you've got to do it. So, mobilization versus persuasion. It is fair to say, it's more than fair to say, that there is an ongoing debate in the Democratic Party about whether you should persuade people or mobilize people. Some of you in this room may say, well, I haven't heard that. I mean, everybody knows to mobilize. Again, anecdotes. Yes, that might be true for you. But across the state and across the country, there is a huge debate about mobilization versus persuasion. For their parts, Republicans decided that question a long time ago. When's the last time you saw any Republican candidate trying to win over Dems? They don't. Why are we trying to do that to their voters? It doesn't make sense.
If anybody doubts that, just follow the Athens-Clarke County Republican Party or the County Republican Party Facebook pages, and you'll see that they make no efforts.
They know it doesn't work. They don't want it to work because we're not on their team. They do not care about us. Why are we trying to be the nice guys here and be like, oh, guys, no, stop it. Just stop it. Identity matters more than anything. It does. Identity matters more than anything. It's about the party, not the candidate. In fact, in the 2016 election, less than half of Republican voters who voted for Trump didn't like him. I should reword that. Less than half liked him. More than half didn't like him. They thought he was a terrible person. They didn't care. They voted for him anyway. Why? Because it was about the party. And I cannot stress that enough. Democrats are going to vote for you because you're Democrat. Republicans are going to vote for them because they're Republican. Why are we covering Trump here? The 2020 elections are coming up. It's a presidential election. And whether you like it or not, regardless of whether you're even on a board of education, well, what does local board of education have? This is all about political tribes now. That's all it is. So whether we like it or not, the upcoming 2020 races, even at the local and state level, will be heavily influenced by the top of the ticket. The Democratic nominee for president and Trump are either going to mobilize or suppress the vote turnout. And what I mean by suppress is if you have a candidate that's not very energizing, they're not going to motivate people, they're not going to be tempted to show up, that's suppression. So we saw this happen here in Georgia with Abrams and Kemp. People showed up to vote either for Kemp or for Abrams. Your campaign, as much as it pains me, because I was campaign manager during that season, my ability to get them to show up in the first place wasn't very significant. What we're going to talk about later is I'm going to point out, though, once they're there, we need to make sure they vote for your candidate along the way. Most folks will be going to the polls to vote for president, so it's your job to help mobilize them and make sure that while they're there, they finish the ballot. There is such a thing as ballot fatigue, and there is such a thing, it's a very real phenomenon of ballot drop-off. Also, we know that people can get saturated, and it can be too much. And people can be like, I'm checking out of this. You don't want that to happen. So your goal as a candidate and a campaign is to make sure that they don't pull themselves out, that they don't disengage. You need to make sure they show up. We've spent the last several slides really hammering home a point here. The 2020 race will be about Trump at all levels of the ballot. If you in this room right now are thinking, well, maybe not my race, you're wrong. You will not be winning over converts. Even those Republican voters that hate him, as we saw in 2016, even those that hate him are still going to be casting ballots for Republicans on that ticket. There will always be anecdotal cases. I'm sure you can find me somebody, maybe your neighbor, who is switching to the Democratic Party. I get it. I believe you. But that doesn't happen in the majority of cases. And right now, we're only concerned about the majority of cases. So, let's finish up this bit before we have a break here. We have to come to terms with the fact that not all candidates are likable, inspiring, or energizing. Who here was like excited about Mondale, Al Gore, or John Kerry? Now those are presidential, but if it's safe to say in this room maybe, when we were out canvassing, we had a lot of people tell us that they weren't very thrilled about some local candidates, like John Barrow. There were some who very much were, but then there were some that were like, oh, he's too centrist for me. It is possible for a candidate to actually not be very inspiring, and that is a death sentence to their campaign. No amount of campaign power, willpower, or even awesome people volunteering, being staff members, like you just can't make up for an uninspiring candidate. So if you're in this room and you're thinking about being a candidate, your number one goal above everything is you have to be the one that inspires, and you are the one who's going to have to be the one that mobilizes. What we end up seeing happening is that if you are not a very inspiring candidate, if you're not very energizing, they don't go in and vote for the other guy. They just don't vote. They skip that spot on the ballot. And sometimes in nonpartisan races, so I want to go back to your nonpartisan thing, if they don't know enough about either candidate, if they didn't get enough cues from the campaigns, they don't want to vote for the wrong person. So guess what they do? They don't vote. And if they don't like their candidate, they don't vote. So it's not that they vote for the other person. You aren't going to get a Trump person to vote for you. They may not like their candidate, but they certainly aren't going to vote for you. We see this in drop-offs on ballots. So big picture, persuasion works in primaries and nonpartisan. In the primaries, you have to separate yourself from your opponent. You have to. Nonpartisan races, voters are looking for cues. Persuasion can work. But voters, say mobilization works in the general and in partisan elections. And that is your goal. As a campaign, you are there to make sure they show up, they vote, and they vote for you. Okay, let's take a quick break, stretch your legs, let everything I've just inundated with kind of soak in. Maybe, 5 minutes or so?
Crew?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen. So, at the request of somebody in this room, Linda.
Yes.
So, if we could just please take one moment, just kind of introduce ourselves. So, I know we had a few late stragglers. I am Avery Murdie. And, ma'am, would you please just introduce yourself to the room?
I'm Audrey Hughes.
And they did this in several other trainings, so I guess I'll just continue it. Would you please tell us, if you are a candidate or part of a campaign or volunteer, or what capacity you have?
Okay. I
going
have
to-
volunteered. I don't know what I'm going to do in the future.
And that's an acceptable answer.
Time will tell.
All right, sir.
Jason Pratt, 8th grade math teacher, and probably more support.
Carol Myers, I've worked on lots of campaigns, and I'm considering running for commissioner.
Mark Martin, running for District 2. Also math teacher, this is my colleague. So.
Cool, awesome, thank you.
That's another colleague.
Oh, wow.
Yes, I forgot
I
that.
thought you all.
Ariana, I'm running for Georgia House District 27.
Oh, congratulations.
Terry Thompson, retired math teacher. And I just moved to Georgia from New Jersey and want to get involved in
Glad to have you here, thank you.
Deborah Gonzalez, former state representative from your case study, HD 147, and candidate for 2020.
Good. Linda Gilbert, I've worked on several campaigns in the past and intend to again.
I'm Rita Carlson, and I'm the campaign manager for Andrea Stevenson. I helped her the last election, and I was the virtual phone banking person. And the same people that are on her committee the last time is on the committee again, which says something to her character. And I'm glad. I've been dabbling in politics for years, and I like to plan strategy and stuff. So
Glad to have you here.
Mm-hmm.
Sir?
Andrew Ferguson, and potential candidate for Georgia 10.
Ali Elliman, campaign worker.
Glad to have you.
Emily Shirley, volunteer, and will at least continue to be a volunteer.
Adam Shirley, ditto, volunteer, hoping to be a good worker bee for a couple of campaigns next year.
Glad to have you here, ma'am.
Tisha Banks, special education teacher, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade for Gwinnett County. Possibly going to run. I want to flip a Republican seat. I'm here to learn and try to hone my skills in. I'm also in the Georgia Windless class this coming year. So I'm here to learn.
Glad to have you, sir.
Thank you.
Jerry Dayton, the Gwinnett County Democrats. I'm going to do everything I can in 2020 to help Deborah and whoever else runs in Athens.
Glad to have you.
Hey, I'm Lydia Alateris. I'm a sociologist, UGA. I've worked on some campaigns at the local level, state house and state senate, and volunteered, and I'm here to see how I can help other people.
Hey, Jonathan Wallace, former rep for 119, and also part of the Gwinnett Democrats, recruiting for folks for any seats in Gwinnett County too. So if you know somebody who lives in Gwinnett County who might be willing, contact myself or Jared. Yeah, always trying to learn more, see how we can do better next time.
Hi, I'm Lee Miller. I'm from the Hall County Democrats. I was on the Josh McCall campaign for Congress last year, and I'm hoping to run for House District 30 in Hall County. And I'm also in the WIN class this year.
Oh! Well, congratulations. Thank you for being here.
I'm Rhonda Hicks, and I a volunteer, and I aspire to vote for Deborah Gonzalez again.
And sir?
I'm Chuck Rosenberger, Oconee Democrat, and I was going to run until I noticed that Jared was 3 inches taller than I.
There's a trick to that. Just don't stand next to him. Hey, there are weird things. I mean, at the end of the day, one of the things we can walk away with is the voters are weird. They just are, okay? And I will kid you not, there are things you can do, though, to work around it. Like, if you know that's the case, especially when you do, like, photo shoots and stuff with your candidate, let's say that they are perhaps vertically challenged. Don't pair them next to a tall person, or, do photos that maybe are just the knee up or something. Like, there are ways that you can get around it and not address it because, again, voters are weird. So, getting back on track, Democrats, Republicans, and Independents. Here's what we know about voters, okay? At the end of the day, 9 out of 10 Democrats vote straight down the ticket for Democrats, and the exact same thing happens with Republicans. 9 out of 10 Republicans vote straight down the ticket. You aren't going to win over converts. I know, I keep saying this, but I really cannot stress it enough. 91% of Republicans across the country, 91%, have a negative view of Democrats. If they have a negative view, there's nothing you can say that's going to win them over. This has actually increased sharply in the last 20, 25 years. A lot of people say they are independents. Many of you might say that you are independents. You might know neighbors or people on your street that say they're independents. Actually, there are more people who claim to be independents than who claim to be Democrats or Republicans. But they're lying. And I can't blame them. If I'm honest, I can't blame them. Who in Hall County or Jackson County, if you are a Democrat, wants to publicly admit that you're a Democrat? You don't want to deal with your neighbors and all of that, so it makes sense. This, nationally, this is according to Pew Research, okay? Pew Research. 38% of people claim to be independents. That's what they claim. But when we look at voting records, only 7% of the electorate is actually an independent, meaning that they frequently will flip their votes. Democratic voters actually comprise the largest percentage, 48%. This has been stable, like rock solid stable, for the last 24 years. Rock solid stable. I would like to point out here, okay, these are Republicans. Nationally, this is the problem Democrats kind of struggle with. Nationally, Republicans just register at a higher rate and vote at a higher rate. This is Democrats over on this side. These are your true independents. And what can we see about true independents? They're the least likely to be registered and the least likely to vote. So, why should we be wasting a ton of time and resources and manpower to reach out to them? There is an untapped market, and that is our own. This is sad, folks. This is sad. This represents the number of people, number of voters who have been contacted by the Democratic Party. And historically, it's less than 25% of voters that are contacted by the Democratic Party. Right now, it's sitting about 23%. But remember, on the slides previous, 48% of voters are Democratic. But we're only reaching less than half of them. So I keep stressing mobilization because, folks, we aren't reaching half of our voters. We can do better. Why waste time on independents or winning over Republicans if you aren't even reaching out to Democratic voters? You need to make sure they show up and cast a ballot. Canvassing, where you have one-on-one conversations, are the best. We have decades of research. In fact, there's one guy, no, two gentlemen, Green and Gerber, who have basically made their whole career, academic careers, studying efficacy of campaign tactics. But they show that good quality face-to-face conversations drastically increases voter turnout and voter share. Now, oftentimes you will hear campaigns brag about how many doors they've knocked on. We are guilty of it too, but I'll tell you why. We've knocked on 10,000. We've knocked on 15,000. Okay, the knocking doesn't matter. It doesn't make a difference how many you knock on. You can knock on 15 or 30,000. The only thing that matters is how many you actually had a conversation with. Okay? However, your volunteers want to hear how many they've knocked on. So, while you might be espousing these stats, you're doing it to make your group feel better because your campaign depends on them. You need to make your volunteers feel like they have a sense of agency and like they're doing something and accomplishing something, because they are. And ultimately, the more doors they knock on, they're eventually going to talk to people. But it's not the number of doors, it's the number of conversations.
Are you addressing how to get those doors to open? When? What time?
Yeah, we will get to that.
Okay, good.
And this can increase turnout by as much as 20% or 8 percentage points. And again, some other studies show 9. It's the quality that matters more than quantity. Time that we spend. So you need to spend the time to properly train your volunteers. If you are sitting here's a list, go knock on the doors. You are better off not sending anybody than having somebody create a negative impression. If that is what the end result is going to be, don't send them. So I'll give you another example. I had a young lady who, she showed up late to the campaign office after everybody had already gone out. We like to send people with partners, work two sides of the streets, efficiency and safety. She didn't have a partner, so I went with her. And, you know, she needs to have some ownership on this. She shouldn't be there just following me around. So we talked about some things, and, you know, there's a little bit of a script that we have. And I knocked on the first door or two, and then on the third one I said, would you like to take this one? And she gets up there, and I can't blame her, but I'm pointing this out because this is something we need to be aware of. Knocks on the door. Hi, my name is, I guess that's me. I am here to, that is not going to do it. Reading off the script isn't going to do it. That's all. Reading off the script just isn't personal, okay? The script is there just to give you some context. And I am going to talk a little bit later about appreciation, whether it's sending a mailer or a postcard or, hey, we're out in your neighborhood. Excuse me, sir, are you Martin?
Yes, yes.
Hey, Martin, I'm Avery. Hey, look, sorry to bother you here, but I just wanted to let you know that I am with the Gonzalez campaign, or I'm with the Abrams campaign, or I'm with a gentleman named Martin. I'm with this campaign, and we're out in the neighborhood telling voters, thank you for showing up and casting your ballots. Your vote makes a difference. So, just want to tell voters like you, we appreciate that. Do you know if you plan on voting this? And so you start this engagement and get them talking and what matters to you. And if you have a 5 or 10 minute conversation with that person, all the better. If you only get to 20 houses instead of your list of 50 because you had conversations, terrific. Who cares if you didn't reach those other people on the list because you had 20 quality visits, and that's what matters. Okay? And if each volunteer is having that same experience, you have just made a huge impact on your campaign overall. So you need to be positive. Show appreciation. The script is only there for context to give you some talking points. Don't read it. Don't use it. And it's also going to vary depending on who opens the door, right? We also need to keep this in consideration. Voters, this is an emotional act. And voters are more likely to engage with a canvasser who looks like them, who sounds like them, who perhaps is somebody that they can see as part of their tribe. So what I mean is, if we're canvassing in an area where the average age is 55 plus, an 18-year-old chipper person is probably not going to be very relatable to them. At the same time, if it's a whole bunch of elderly white people canvassing and knocking on doors of young African Americans, it's going to be hard for them to feel like they know where they're coming from. It works if you, as the person who's cutting up these turfs and sending volunteers out, if you can make sure that you are sending canvassers to areas where both canvasser and the recipient can feel safe, secure, comfortable, and can relate to each other. That is more likely to create that engagement, get the doors to open, get the conversation starting. It's not always going to happen. It's not always going to be logistically feasible, but you need to try. So conversations are only effective within 90 days. There are a lot of people who want to start canvassing sooner than that. But there is message decay. And the truth is, within like a week, it's actually like 7 days, the people who have been visited, they forget what you talked about, but they remember the feeling, the positive or negative feeling. The feeling lasts longer than the message. So this is why a quality conversation matters. Because truthfully, you could talk about anything. Talk about their dog. Oh, that's the cutest dog in the world you have. What's their name? You don't have to talk politics. When you leave and we're like, oh gosh, golly, that was a fun conversation. That's the only thing that actually matters, because that's the only thing they're going to remember 90 days from then, okay? So, I am going to stress this. The content doesn't matter as much as the quality. Yes, don't get me wrong, content matters, not as much as the quality, that feeling, okay? So, key points. Forget trying to win over non-Democrats, and yes, there are some independents. We know that. There are some. It's like 7%. Very small. They just don't vote often. They're the least likely to show up. So there aren't many of them, and they don't really vote. But we're only reaching about half of Democratic voters. We can do better. Look, I hate to say it, but we really should learn from the Tea Party, okay? The Tea Party understood that their goal was not to win over moderates. They didn't try. They didn't want to, okay? Their whole refrain was take back our country. Scholars of the Tea Party agree that grassroots mobilization was the key. Again, we're talking about, they said, you know what? We need to go find our people and get them to the polls, and that's what they did. They met weekly, made plans, propagandized, they showed up at halls, knocked on doors, and they changed the face of American politics. I would argue for the worse. Changing demographics also change our strategy. I want to point this out here. Only 43% of our total population is voting. As sad as that is, only 43% of our total population is voting. The reason I point this out is because, again, there are a lot of people and they're going to have a lot of opinions and they're going to say, this is what I believe. We're not very concerned about that. We're concerned about the 43% who are voting. Actually, it's not even that. We're concerned about our half of the 43% that are voting. Georgia is changing. There is a much larger female demographic than male demographic in Georgia, and females tend to vote Democratic. In terms of race, whites, yes, still comprise the largest percentage. The Latino vote, for many different reasons, is not very high. But I would like to point out here how quickly the demographics are changing. Just 4 years ago, I guess now 5, the white vote share was 64%, or not white vote share, excuse me, the white demographic share of Georgia was 64%, and now it's 59%. They are changing. So if you have been feeling frustrated, if you have been feeling like, this is just the same result over and over again, stay positive. It will get better. Democrats are on the verge of breaking out. In terms of registered voters, okay, in Georgia, the black demographic as a whole is huge at 30%, and whites are only 53%. I talked to you earlier about the spike in the 2018. This is the largest spike in like 60 or 70 years. It is huge. We still didn't reach presidential levels, but it is huge. And what we can currently predict based off of the current level of engagement is that the 2020 engagement is going to be very high. In other words, we're going to reach saturation. Okay? There's going to be a point where about as many people as possible are going to be voting. So it's not really at that point trying to get people to vote. It's about making sure that they complete the ballot. And it's about making sure that that oversaturation, that over-engagement of awareness of what's going on, doesn't push them too far and make them step back and say, I quit, I can't do this anymore. Those are the two things you have to worry about. So, why point out Georgia's demographics? I know that you can't see this, especially in the back. So in Georgia, women are the largest demographic of Democratic voters. Blacks, Hispanics, and Asians are the largest demographic. But even though Hispanics and Asians overwhelmingly, 77%, 70% vote Democratic, their overall registered demographics are very, very small. Okay. Among the college educated tend to vote Democratic. The high school or less than high school tend to vote Republican. Younger people, this is good news. Younger people overwhelmingly vote Democratic. And again, going back to college, if they have some type of college or higher education, they tend to vote Democratic. When you are targeting your voters and when you're making messages, you need to keep this in mind. So who's most likely to vote Democratic? Well, it's younger, college-educated women and minorities. And that probably is not a surprise to anyone in this room. What might be a surprise to individuals in this room, and again, I said at the very beginning, each race is different, so it may not apply to your race, but as a whole across the state, 84% of the Republican Party is white. And 51% of the Democratic Party in the state of Georgia is black. And this has huge implications for candidates that are staking out policy positions. So, big picture here, the presidential race matters and will affect you. If we look at how people vote immediately after the presidential or top ticket, 94% of the immediate following races get the same vote as the party that they voted for at the top. They aren't going to switch. All right, now we get to the fun part. Tactics, mailers, yard signs, and more. All right. Facebook is your friend. I know, we all hate Facebook. Well, okay, I do. I hate Facebook. But we actually have a lot of growing evidence that it works. The caveat is if you're using it correctly. Look, it's like having a wrench, right? If you're trying to use a wrench like a screwdriver, it's a tool, but it's not going to get the job done. You've got to use it correctly. Engagement is king. And we have a very good friend. His name's Chris. But Chris was part of this experiment where they looked at 61 million people. 61 million people. And what they discovered is that among those individuals, when they shared the I voted sticker online, it significantly increased their friends and family members voting as well. Because it's a public visual act. And at the very beginning, we talked about peer pressure, right? Facebook, getting your volunteers to talk and engage and share their stories, getting your voters to share that they early voted, makes a difference. A strong media presence requires engagement, not just posting reminders. Posting pictures does nothing. You've got to create engagement. And the Facebook's feed algorithm, it prioritizes that commenting and sharing. That's why you need that engagement. What about Twitter? I know a lot of people who use Twitter. Truth is, 80% of the tweets come from 10% of the people. That is true. But what we also know is that most of those people on Twitter are Democratic. So they're also slightly more white and slightly more affluent. So it actually can be a good place for Democrats. You just have to keep in mind how many of your voters do you think are actually on it, though. If you can't see in the back, this is YouTube and Facebook up here, and this is everything else. How many people, this is the percentage of people who use it. Facebook is 69, 70%, YouTube 73, Instagram's 37, Snapchat's 24, Twitter is 22% of adults. You need to keep this in mind. How are you going to be targeting your voters? How are you going to be engaging them? If you are on WhatsApp, that's a waste of time. You're not reaching anybody. Facebook is the social media platform, whether we like it or not. I would like to point out, some people don't know this, you can export a list from Votebuilder and import it into Facebook and target social media ads to that list. And if you want to know how to do that, send me an email later, I'll walk you through it.
Say that again, you can what?
So in Votebuilder, you know how you make these targeted lists of people?
Yeah.
You can export that list as a CSV file, and then you can import that file into Facebook's Business Manager, and you can create ads and target ads to those individuals.
Oh.
It's not perfect because if you don't have, Facebook uses information like first name, last name, address, phone numbers to try and match up. If you're missing some of that information, Facebook has a hard time matching it up. But usually, like, it actually does a pretty good job finding the majority, maybe 75, 80% of the people, and that's good enough, you know, for me to try and target them. And when we look at where adults get their news, Facebook is overwhelmingly the top source for where U.S. adults get their news, as sad as that is. But for a campaign, you need to be aware of that. Also, this may not apply to some of the smaller races, but if I understand, we may have some campaigns in here dealing with like congressional races, and maybe you guys will be having some larger radio or TV spreads. The truth is, again, going back to the majority, or I should say, yeah, it is. When it comes to college educated or higher, more of them are Democratic than Republican. And of those folks, they're on the internet. Massively more than any other outlet. It is the high school and less, which is more likely to be the Republican crowd that watches TV. Books, magazines. So this is the books, magazines. Less than 1% of adults are getting their news from books, magazines, or using them on a regular basis. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
So if we're looking at this, or this idea of the local newspapers or advertising in the local newspapers, if we're seeking to reach our Democratic base, isn't a good idea.
No.
Or a good spend of money.
No, newspapers, like, yes, about 16, 17% of people with college degrees or higher are using newspapers on a regular basis. But again, that's 17%, and a little more than half of them are Democratic, so it's a very small percentage of people. I know that this goes back to like tradition and the way things have always been done. Like, there's this push to, well, we need to advertise in newspapers, we need to advertise in magazines, we need to advertise on the radio. People aren't really using that. So it's a waste of time and resources.
And the flagpole, same thing, same category?
Yeah, I hate to say it. I do.
Well, they have online stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Online is where things are going. Yeah. The youth vote, now what you can do is, like, you can be in print, maybe an interview or something, right, and then share that content online. Like, find a way to turn that content into online content. So the youth vote is the future. The census found that 36% of citizens 18 to 29 reported voting in last year's midterm election. That is a phenomenal, that's low, yes, 36% is low, okay? But compared to what it was 20%, and that was in 2014. Now we're up to 36%. The youth are getting involved, and the youth are overwhelmingly Democratic. We need to find ways to reach out to them, engage them, mobilize them. That is an untapped source of voters, and they're also the most likely to volunteer. So you need to reach out to them. Go to the Young Democrats at the local college, university, grab members of the Democrats from your local high school, Young Dem clubs. Reach out to the neighborhoods and community. Find the youth. They will be your canvassers and volunteers.
Quick question.
Yes?
How do you deal with the number of students that are not registered in Clarke County? How do you use them for just campaign volunteers?
Yes.
And then just, that's it?
They aren't going to vote for you, but that's not why we need them. It's difficult to ask people the people who are most likely to vote are going to be 55 and older, but it's difficult for them to knock on a lot of doors, you know, and a lot of them are still, they're hesitant, they don't want to, they're not comfortable with it. You got like a 20-year-old, and you're like, hey, free food afterwards, they'll go knock on 1,000 doors for you. So You need to be smart about how you're using your individuals. Door-to-door canvassing. It only takes 15 contacts to increase your vote share by 1. The problem is it's time consuming. It's very time consuming. There is, interestingly enough, a spillover effect. If you talk to one person at the door, that information spills over to the rest of the household, and we know that talking to a spouse or partner, you don't even have to talk to the other person. That spouse or partner that you didn't talk to but is in that house is more likely to go out and vote as well. So there's a spillover effect.
And that's the actual face-to-face contact.
Yes,
not
that's-
the dropping.
That's what we're going to talk about here, the literature drops.
Oh.
You know, you see those door hangers,
Yeah.
like you leave the door hangers or you just leave the literature. Okay. There have been a lot of observational studies and experimental studies with this kind of stuff. So I'm giving you I've read through all the stuff, I've compacted it into a very short space here. 1 vote per 189 drops. Okay? Direct mail. We're going to talk about direct mail for just a little bit because there are some caveats with it, okay? There's actually caveats with everything, but in a nonpartisan race, because remember, they're looking for cues, okay? They're looking for cues. You can increase it by 1 vote after contacting 273 people. In a partisan race, we don't see any evidence that it works. But here are the caveats. In closely contested races, it can make a difference. In the nonpartisan, which we just talked about, it can make a difference. And in low information races, it can make a difference. Phone calls. We're talking about volunteers on the phone having a personal phone call. You get 1 vote for every 35 people that you talk to. Yes, phone calls are faster. You can whip through them. But that depends on you having accurate phone lists. There are different companies that you can purchase these phone lists from, but even then, you're looking at about a 40%, 45% success rate of getting accurate numbers back. Radio, you can increase turnout by maybe 1%. TV is less than 0.5%. And those are also some of the more expensive. TV is the most expensive. Email and robocalls, please don't do them at all, ever. They don't work, and they actually anger people. Festivals and rallies, you know, the get out the vote rallies things, they're actually decent. It's a 1% to 2% increase by having these types of festivals and community events and gatherings.
You know, that email and robocalls is the same with those textings now? You know, when they...
So the texting is different.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about this in just a second because, is everybody here familiar with like an app called Hustle?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah, okay. So it invokes strong emotion, and people either love it or hate it, the recipients we're talking about, but it still gets them to vote. You just need to be careful with it because you don't want to bombard them. Here's a bad thing that can happen. Let's go to 2020, okay? And let's say that, I don't know, Elizabeth Warren, I'm just going to pick somebody, the first name that came to my mind. She's now the presidential candidate. Let's say that her campaign is texting somebody here in Clarke County. And then let's say I'm the campaign manager for another House race or Senate race, and we are texting them. And then let's say the congressional rep is that angers people, and that gets them upset. You need to work and coordinate with other campaigns, if at all possible, to make sure that you guys aren't bombarding these individuals. Texting works. Too much saturation has a negative effect. I'm sorry, Wallace first, and then...
So I was going to ask, you mentioned that a couple of times. What is the saturation point? Is there any recognized guidelines for that?
Again, it varies by precinct, but like in Oconee saturation is around 77%. So a voter turnout in Oconee, in their Watkinsville areas, and it's around 77%. They're usually anywhere from 72 to 75, the higher end to 77, but that's the point where, like with our
77% of what?
77% of registered voter turnout.
No, so I mean like I think
how many texts?
How many texts?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you meant saturation is in like how many turn out.
No.
Because there's a saturation point of how many turn out.
Such as contacts, door knocks, etc.
We don't have good data on that because it depends on the voter receiving it. Here's what we know. What we do know is that high information voters and voters that have already made up their minds, yeah, I'm going to vote, one contact is enough to actually get them to show up. People who, like, if it's a mom or dad who has 3 kids and they got to pick up their kids after school and they got to go to the library to vote, and is it worth taking 3 kids with them? And they only know the presidential candidate, but they don't really know any of the others. So these are our low information voters who have other things going on in their lives. It may take up to 9 contacts to get that. And we're not talking 9 texts, we're talking 9 total. And that can be a combination of canvassing, text message, phone call, mailer. All of those count as contacts. It can take up to 9 contacts for the lower end voters. Okay? So maybe the 9 contacts, the 9 texts will work for that person, but those 9 contacts for the person who's already decided, that's too much. That's the saturation point for them. So the answer to your question is, it's difficult to tell you exactly because it depends on the voter. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier. The content of mobilization message isn't actually as important as the quality, timing, and the delivery of the message. And what I mean by this is an emotional act. We need to create visually inspiring cues for them and give them a positive feeling. And in terms of timing, if you are out canvassing now, 18 months too soon, canvassing now will create a positive, measurable experience. We can actually say, yeah, if you go out and canvass right now, you're going to increase the likelihood that those people think positively about Democrats and are like, yeah, I'll vote. But we're 18 months out. After 90 days, there is 0 difference unless you are going to go back to them. If you don't have a plan to go back to them frequently, 90 days is your window. And that's why for most campaigns, most of that field work is done within the 90 days. We're talking, August, September, October before the election, because it decays quickly. Yard signs. First, we're going to talk about who puts up a yard sign, because the truth is, yard signs actually have 2 categories here. There are the displayers and the receivers, so the people who see the message, okay? People who display a yard sign are more likely to be white, affluent, higher educated, and live in the suburbs by far. Around here, in some of the more rural areas, maybe that doesn't apply, but we're talking generally, right? And the truth is, it's about pride. It's about claiming ownership of, I am part of that team. It means something to them. The yard sign is going up in their yard, not because they think that they're going to win over people, and it's not even for yard sign wars. That stuff is really kind of a hyperbole. You'll get the sensational story of like neighbors with their yard sign wars. That's actually less than 2% of all known observable cases of yard signs in several different studies. Most people just put it up, and when interviewed, they say, yeah, I'm proud to be a Democrat, or I'm proud to be a Republican. It's a part of their identity. Now, we also know that people who display yard signs are more likely to be politically engaged. They're more likely to vote than non-yard sign displayers. They do think that they work. I mean, it makes sense, right? They're the ones putting it up. They think that they work. But they're also more willing to volunteer and donate than non-yard sign displayers. So we might be looking at yard signs wrong. Instead, we should be looking at yard signs as an opportunity to find individuals to donate to your campaign and to volunteer for your campaign, okay? The research is mixed on the question of whether it works. Look, just like the festivals, they actually do create a very slight bump. It would be inaccurate of me to say they don't work at all. A more accurate answer would be to say they're one of the more costly things a campaign can spend money on, and you get a very small bump. So your campaign, you as the candidate, you as the campaign manager, you need to decide, what's our point? How many do we want? Because you're not doing it to win over votes, you're doing it for your base, and that's important.
Well, how's the what did you say, the vote per response on yard signs versus direct mail, which is also really expensive. I mean, it's 1 per 273.
So in terms of the percent raised, mailers are still more cost effective than yard signs. I mean, just in mathematical terms. the reason I say we might be looking at yard signs all wrong is because here's my advice. Get a couple. Don't invest in a whole bunch. But you need to get a couple, and they need to be on hand, and you need to give them out for free to people who request them. And you need to target those folks who request them as volunteers and donors. Try to turn them into a part of that campaign, because they are far more likely to do that than people who don't request yard signs. And the Abrams campaign was on the right track, but what they did wrong was they were kind of holding the campaign signs hostage. They were selling them, right? And they're like, hey, we will give you one for free if you volunteer. This goes back to feelings, personal feelings. They were making their voters and their volunteers upset and creating negative feelings, and you don't want that. So have a few, give them away for free, follow up with them. Hey, how's that yard sign? Did you get that? Like, so great. Hey, we're having a door knocking event. Would you be interested? Follow up with them, okay? That needs to be a separate list that you're keeping track of, and you really need to target them. All right, going back to HG 117 real quick, because we're going to talk about some of the ways that we implemented these research-based, evidence-based tactics. So again, I want to stress this. Look at the difference that we made in some of our underperforming precincts. We turned the second lowest one into the highest performing precinct. Okay? We had huge gains. In fact, some of our precincts compared to 2016, we actually outperformed Hillary in her 2016 campaign. We actually outperformed her in 8 of the 13 precincts. So, before the 2018 midterms, when I talk about universe, if you don't know what that means, some of you do, but if you don't know what that means, the universe is like what we consider to be our targeted population that we're going after, okay? So there were over 18,000 voters in the district with vote builder scores below 50. If you don't know what that means, 0 to 50, those are Republican voters. 50 to 100 are who we think are Democratic voters, okay? So there were over 18,000 people who scored in the area we would consider Republicans. Only 13,600 scored in the area we thought were Democrats. Again, we knew we were outnumbered. There were 2,000 to 3,000 unknowns. So our universe, who we were targeting, was only 13,600. But the truth is, because there were some at the lower end of that, in the 50s and low 60s, and because there were some in the 90s to 100s who we knew were going to vote, our actual subset was only 8,000, the ones kind of in the middle that we were heavily targeting. Turnout in midterms is always lower than in the presidential. So again, we knew that we had to get our targeted voters to show up. This is what I meant earlier by, this is how many votes Hillary got out of our precincts, and this is how many votes we got. We almost matched Hillary's turnout. But in fact, the 119 race outperformed Hillary. So our targeted universe, those 13,600, we reached 72% of them. In the that was 2016. And in 2016, of those folks who we thought were Republican, the Republicans captured 81% of that group. But in 2018, we dropped less than 1% in the universe we were trying to capture. The Republicans dropped 12% of their universe they were trying to capture. Both 117 and 119 employed similar strategies. They were adjacent to each other, 117 and 119. That's why I keep talking about them if you don't know. And the campaigns would communicate sometimes with each other, so we were fairly aware of what each other was doing. We used the following tactics. We knocked on over 15,000 doors. And I told you earlier, it doesn't matter how many you knock on, how many you talk to. We spoke with 5,000 individuals. We had a success rate of 33%. To put that in perspective, now we got lucky there because the truth is it's around 20 to 25% is the norm. So we were just slightly above that. We had nothing to do with the success rate. They're either home or they're not. But part of it is also when you go canvassing, right? We canvassed on Saturdays and a few Sunday afternoons. You don't want to interrupt football in the South. That's a no-no. Unfortunately, you can't really get around that. You've got to canvass at times. Do not interrupt dinner. Don't interrupt lunch. Don't interrupt dinner. That makes people upset. Remember, this is an emotional thing. When you schedule...
What time is dinner? Yeah.
Yeah? It does change.
Yeah.
It does change, but you need to consider a 7 o'clock cutoff. Don't go past 7 o'clock. The number of people who are willing to open their doors and talk to you and be engaged drops significantly after 7 o'clock. And sundown. Don't canvass after sundown. It's a safety issue. People get upset. And in the mornings, don't canvass before 9. And 9 even, a lot of, again, you're going to get, your mileage is going to vary depending on who you're talking to, but don't canvass before 9. If you're showing up somebody's door at 8 and they're still in PJs, you just totally lost it with that voter. We used the Hustle app to send over 16,000 texts. We had one lady, one volunteer, who by herself sent 8,000 texts. She sat there and sent 8,000 texts. I felt ashamed to even be in the same room with her. But we did this using 3 rounds of texting at key moments. So the 16,000 was broken up over 3 periods. So that's the total, 16,000. We did it days before the early voting started. Hey, early voting, go vote. We did it days before it ended. Hey, you've only got 2 days left. Be sure to go vote. And we did it a couple days before the general election. Hey, Tuesday is election day. So timing is important. We sent over 5,000 postcards, each of which was handwritten by a volunteer. That is a lot of postcards. We had a lot of people locally do it. I managed to snag a few groups who were in California. I got a group in Oregon and Washington as well, who I don't know, part of it's just dumb luck, but I got them to do 2,000 postcards for us. No, maybe 1,500. So, but they're all handwritten. I just sent them a script, and I bought the postcards and sent it to them, and I bought the stamps and sent it to them, and they all just wrote it out. We use literature that displays the top ticket and other recognizable local or notable Democratic candidates. Maybe if they didn't recognize ours, they might recognize somebody else on there and be tempted to go vote for them. And all contacts with the voters, so the canvassing, texting, postcards, everything was personalized. We use thank you for voting quite often. Research shows that appreciation increases turnout. Funny story, the research shows that shaming people is the best tool to get them to show up. But it makes them angry. So, you need to decide. So there have been several studies done where they actually sent folks letters. They had a group that sent people letters and said, hey, did you know that public voting records, or that voting records are public? We can see that, and then the name here, did not vote in 2016. Guess what happened? They voted in 2018. But when there were follow-up surveys, they were not happy about it. So, what's the second best thing that increases turnout? Appreciation. Sometimes you got to decide what's worth it. How badly do you want to win? We went the appreciation route. Mailers can help with turnout and name recognition. This is critical in nonpartisan races and in low turnout races, Board of Education races. If you are on a lower spot on the ballot, mailers can help. Though, even though it's a partisan general, if you are running for state house or public insurance commissioner or something, those are things that most people are not very familiar with. So it can help with name recognition. If you're Stacey Abrams, you don't need a mailer. Everybody knows you. They do need to be large. Larger the better. Yes, we know 95% of mailers go straight from the mailbox to the trash. We know that. That's why the larger the better is better. Because what's going to happen is they're going to take this stuff from the mail and they're going to walk over to the trash can. But in doing so, we actually know from research that they catch the bigger things. And as they put them in, they tend to do it this way, one at a time. And they take a moment to stare at it, look at the backside, and then it goes in the trash. You need to get their attention. If you're Stacey Abrams, you don't, or Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, you don't need a mailer. But if you are running for a spot that you think people don't know you or your name, a mailer can help. You need to be succinct, clear, evoke emotion, and do not overdo it with text. There are a lot of candidates and campaigns who think they have to put their policy platform on a mailer. Nobody reads that. In that 5 seconds where they're looking at it before it goes in the trash, nobody reads it. And be positive. Higher scores, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, might only need one contact, But lower scores are going to need as many as 9 contacts, and a mailer can count towards one of those contacts. This is just an example because some people may not know how the price breakdowns work, okay? And I spoke with her. She said, go ahead, please put it up there. So this is just an individual in North Georgia who can do mailing. Let's say you want to do 5,000, okay? If you want to do 5,000 full color postcards, a 6x11 is going to cost you $600 for 5,000. Now postage is going to get you, now we'll estimate safely 25 cents. Depending on which carrier you go with, they can have better rates, okay? But I'm going to go with the higher end, 25, to give you an idea. So for these 5,000, it's only $600 for the actual mailer, but it's going to be an additional $12.50 to send them out. And I want to show you how we incorporated some of the research into what we did. The front side and back side, okay? So this was a mailer that was targeting female voters and households likely to have kids. Note that this mailer came out during the Me Too movement. So we were trying to invoke emotion. As you can see, we have some text, but it's minimal. This one was a mailer targeting voters ages 24 to 44 and households likely to have kids. We are trying to invoke emotion. I want to point this out in a couple slides, but you will notice a recurring theme is that we use a lot of check marks on things. I'll tell you why in a minute. This one, we're targeting working age individuals, men, and minorities. Again, if you are going to implement your tactics, this shouldn't be a blanket, one-size-fits-everyone approach. You need to be mindful of who you're targeting, and you need to adjust accordingly. So we would send out 3,600 mailers to this group, and then we'd send out 4,000 mailers to this group, and then we would send, like 2,500 to this group. Some of them might overlap, but if they overlapped, I made sure that they were individuals who didn't have a very strong voting history. If they did have a strong voting history, I removed them from the targeted list so that they weren't inundated with 1 billion mailers. Now, research shows that when voters think it's close, therefore their vote matters, they are far more likely to show up. What we know is that when they think it's going to be a blowout, either for their team or against, they don't show up. Why show up to vote? Because there's a cost associated with voting. You got to take time out of your day. You got to stand in line. You got to stand in the rain in some cases. I think that happened in Gwinnett and a few places, right? Okay, there's a cost to voting. So why commit yourself to that cost if you are sure your team's going to win or lose? Competitiveness matters. Here's an example of a digital graphic that we had trying to inform people how close it was. It is true. October 19th of 2018, the polls had it tied 49-49. And if you saw the final result, it was within 60,000 votes. It was that close. Here's the backside of that. And again, we're using the check marks and where they can go vote. Remember I told you that voters punish female candidates for not sticking to stereotypical gender norms? So on this one, we've got, this is on the back of a magazine. Yes, they don't really use magazines. There's a reason for that, for why we did this one. But we had seniors are the highest likely group to advertise. And we got a huge discount because this person we knew, it's a long story. But when we made this one, we stuck with a couple things. Remember I told you earlier, there are ways to get around the whole short candidate thing? You have no idea. Our person could be 7'12", 7'11", I don't know. There are ways to deal with it. We use red, and we're talking about life. It's a universal human experience. We're talking about this emotion, this positive feeling of life and emotion, kind of a stereotypical feminine thing, right? But we're sticking with what the literature says about how Democratic voters perceive female Democratic candidates. Check marks make a difference. Voters are weird about stuff, okay? They're just, if I haven't made that point yet, they're weird. They like certain things. Here's a graphic. Now this was, hey, I voted, that people could share on Facebook and stuff. They like check marks. This is another graphic with a check mark. We didn't have to do anything, really. I mean, there's nothing on here, really, but Our candidate, check mark and name recognition. Oh, check mark, positive. It invokes a positive feeling, and that's all they need. This was our down ballot card that we used, and we did not list everybody. The insurance commissioner is not up there. I mean, we don't have the ballot measures up there, but we've got recognizable figures. We've got the governor. We've got, in this region, people know John Barrow, so we've got John Barrow up there, our candidate, and the Senate candidates. So, example, let me go back to this. The further down a name is, the more people quit filling out the ballot. It's called ballot fatigue. It's a very real phenomenon, and for some races, it's a huge drop-off. Here's an example of ballot fatigue from 2016 Clarke County. 44,000 votes cast for the president, 43,000 cast for the U.S. senator, right below them. This is actually a difference of about 1.5%. The public service commissioner was a drop of 19%. That's a huge, huge drop-off, okay? 2018, if you don't remember filling out that ballot, was a big ballot. 2018 was a big ballot, okay? We knew there would be ballot fatigue. That's why one of the things that we really tried to do was name recognition. Things like Abrams to Gonzalez for our particular candidate, okay? Name recognition. Tie them together so that when they go in there to vote, that name pops out and they're willing to vote instead of quitting. We expect, this is what the research tells us, we expect anywhere from a 1 to 2% drop per level. Again, if we back up here, oh, this was a 1.5% drop, that fits with the literature, and a 19% drop, several spots down, fits with the literature. We expected anywhere from 14 to 28% drop based on our position. We only experienced a 7% drop. We cut that in half. That's huge. That's significant. Okay? Now, everybody good so far? Okay, I want to make sure I'm just not rolling anybody over. Yes, sir?
This is a lot of slides back, but it's a question.
Yeah.
So when you were looking at the Voterbuilder score, and you said you had 8,000, I got the impression that you sort of did not focus on the folks on the top end of the spectrum that you expect to be very, very strong Democrats, and you maybe shifted that window a little bit. I'm curious.
So I should clarify that, okay?
Okay.
Thank you for bringing that up. We did concentrate on a universe of 13,600 people.
Yes.
But it also goes back to what you said earlier about how many contacts you need. I made several different targeting lists and targeting groups, and then we decided when and where and how we were going to target those. The upper ranges, we were only going to hit like once or twice, canvassing with a mailer and be done with them. So the majority of our attention was on that smaller subset, the 8,000, not the total 13,600. But we still made a contact with each and every one of them.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, and so then a follow-on question would be, how far down would you ignore everyone below 50, or would you?
Glad you bring that up.
Okay.
Thank you. We are going to cover that. So, if you don't know, probably everyone here I'm assuming does, but Votebuilder is like a login screen. Votebuilder is a tool that the Democratic Party has that you can purchase an agreement with them to use to access a list of voters. Now, Votebuilder is an online tool that contains information on all registered voters in your district. If you get access to it, it is only for the voters in your race, nowhere else. You purchase access to information for your district only. It includes names, addresses, voting history, phone numbers. There's a caveat here because the phone numbers are terrible. You are better off purchasing your own list and uploading it into Votebuilder. Georgia is a state that does not register voters. If I remember right, I think it's 35 states who do. 35 states that do register their voters. Georgia is not one of those. So when you register, we don't know what you are. Votebuilder tries to get around that by assigning each voter in the database a score based on on several different factors, including demographic information, college educated, black, white, older, younger, okay. Voting history, and I want to let everyone be aware of this. Do not look at primary voting history as any type of guide whatsoever, because the research is very clear that, especially in open primaries, people will vote against a candidate. Democrats will cross the line because, like in 2016, there were several places with open primaries. Democrats voted for the Republican primary. They felt their candidate was going to win, like Bernie was going to win or Hillary was going to win, so they didn't think they needed to cast their vote there. They thought they were being strategic by going across the aisle and voting against Trump. So they would vote for like Jeb Bush or something, okay? So that shows up in their history. And you could look at that and go, wow, they voted like Republican like 3 elections, in a row. Don't use that because, again, voters think they're smart, and many of them are. They're trying to do what they think is a good vote cast for them. They're trying to be strategic. So don't try to use the primary information. I should back up here, though. This score also uses consumer purchasing information. You know how you go to Kroger and you scan your Kroger card? Kroger sells that stuff off. Amazon sells your purchase history off, okay? Facebook sells off your stuff. And what we do is this. So there are whole companies who take this information, they take your demographic information and your consumer information, what you buy, and they create a picture of you. They then compare that picture of you to somebody who looks just like you in a state where we do have party registrations. And they say, does your picture match their picture, and what is their voting history like? And so it's a rudimentary way to make a prediction that we otherwise would be very hard-pressed to do. Now, we're going to talk about how accurate is it then, if that's what they do. A vote builder can be used to create canvassing, walk lists, phone banks, mailing lists, and increase accuracy in targeting potential voters. Okay, when you sign on and you go to the scores, there's going to be a whole bunch of scores here. Don't worry about anything except for the 2018 DNC support. The 2018 DNC Democratic support is really the only score you need to use.
Will it be 2020 then? Will they update it?
If they update it.
Okay.
Last year they didn't update. So last year, I think it was April or May maybe, like the primaries had already happened. And then they updated the scores. So for right now, because we don't know when or what they're going to do, it's the 2018 Democratic support score that you're going to use, okay? So the 90 plus, this is 90 to 100. In Clarke County, there are 13,000 people that are 90 plus. Well, maybe that's not enough to win our race, so we need to lower our score to 75. 75 plus includes this group and the people down to 75. So now we've increased our pool by 7,000 people. We went from 13 to 20. But maybe that's not enough for you to win your race, so you've got to lower your score from 75 to 50. You've increased the pool of people now that you can target, but as we go down in score, we're less sure about how democratic they are, and they're less likely to vote. These folks down here at this end are hardcore Republican, and they're definitely going to vote. In the middle, there are very few voters in the middle. Most people have staked out claims. If we look at voting histories and scores, hardcore Republicans turn out to vote. Hardcore Democrats turn out to vote, just not as much as Republicans. You see this in the middle here? These folks in the middle, who we just aren't sure about, they also just don't vote. This goes back to what we were saying about, independents. These kind of people that we don't have enough information on, or that we aren't sure how they vote, and maybe they aren't sure themselves. They're just very unlikely to vote. So if you need to get more voters, you're going to have to drop your score down. But the lower your score, the less likely they are to be Democrat, and the less likely they are to actually vote. This is the 2018 Clarke County. I'm using this because we might have questions about the efficacy of Votebuilder. Well, I was curious about it too. However, things are always in hindsight. If you can't see, Stacey Abrams in Clarke County, so we're talking all of Clarke County. She got 70% of the vote, 70% of the vote, 70.2%. She had 30,400 votes cast for her. In Clarke County, there were 12,000 people that have scores 0 to 50, so those are Republicans. There were 27,628 people with scores 50 to 100, people we think are Democrat. Now I polled these from Votebuilder immediately afterwards to see who actually voted. This is everyone in Clarke County that cast a ballot, and it told me what their scores were. There were a total of 43,000 people. There's a slight difference here, and it's because immediately when I polled these, some people may have moved out or could be provisional, or okay. That explains the very, very slight discrepancy. But when we look at who we think are Democrats and some of the unknowns, well, who are the unknowns? We get 30,600 people we think are Democrats. She got 30,400. They almost overlap perfectly. It's not causal, but it's a very strong correlation. 30,600 votes, or people who are what we think are Democrats in Votebuilder. 30,400 votes for Stacy. So, again, she got, if we look at the 50 to 100 range, the people that I'm telling you we think are Democrats, she got 70.7% of all voters in that range. All right, I should reword this. 70.7% of all Clarke County voters are in that range. 70.27% of people in Clarke County voted for Stacy. Again, a very strong correlation. Okay? When we look at Clarke County and how these vote scores vote, remember, this is from who actually voted in 2018. And I'm telling you, that 90 to 100 range, these are folks that 71% of them turned out to vote. Down at this range, less than half turned out to vote. The higher the score, the more likely they are to vote. The general election results. Okay, this goes to what you're talking about. So who do we target? What numbers? The 0 to 50, forget them. Do not look at them. Do not use them. Ignore them. They are not your friends. They will vote against you. The 50 to 69 range, this is a tough one. They're not very likely to vote in the first place. And we're not 100% sure if they do vote, if they will vote for you. This group up here, they're going to vote, and they're going to vote for you. They might just need a reminder or two.
That's from the 60.
This is the 90 to 100 range. Where, now again, this is a general rule because each race is going to be different, right? It's possible that you could be in a race where you're outnumbered. Thanks for showing me, man. And if that's the case, maybe you need to lower your scores a little bit. But this 65 to 90 range, the 65 to 90 is where you need to be targeting. These are people who we are very sure are going to vote for you. They're not as likely if we go back. This 65 to 90 range, look at those vote turnouts. We're only in the 50s there. We can do better than that. That was Clarke County. That's who actually voted in the entire county of Clarke with those scores. We can do better than that. This is why I'm telling you, forget trying to win over independents, forget trying to persuade Republicans. We're not doing a good job of getting our own Democrats out to vote. We need to be targeting these individuals and getting them to vote. Because these Democrats are. And these are the ones who are highly engaged. They're the primary voters. These are the ones who want to know your policy positions. They're going to vote. Okay? You don't have to win them over that much. We need to win over those lower scores.
What about for the nonpartisan, like next year in the nonpartisan, I think the nonpartisan and the primary for the president are two different dates, if I remember. So the nonpartisan race is going to be a lower turnout. You would want to go after that 90 to 100.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I mean,
so if I'm the campaign manager for a nonpartisan race that's before the presidential race, I'm going to be hitting this 80 to 100. I know that they will vote, and I know they will vote for me. If I can tell them, I'm on your side, I'm also a Democrat.
Well, if you have like two Democrats. Right?
This is where the persuasion comes in.
Yeah.
This is really
but you're still going to have to hit those.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm going to let my opponent go after the lower scores because if they are not very likely to vote in a general, they're really not likely to vote in a primary. Yes, sir.
Does Votebuilder track people moving within the groups? If the DPI changes to make them more likely or less likely, is the movement?
Yeah, Votebuilder updates monthly.
Is there a strong, have you had a chance to look, is there a big change? Do people move from one group to the next?
To do that, I would have to track at the individual level, and I have not done that.
I got you.
So,
is there a recommendation for which group you would target? I imagine maybe 90 to 100 for volunteering, like maybe do more general get out and vote for the 70 and then a different message for the 90? Or?
So here's something you can do. You make a list of everybody in the 90 to 100 range. You go through, and that list, you also go to the vote history, and you check off they've done at least, and one of the things that I did was 4, and I checked 2016, 14, 12, the generals, 16, 14, 12, the primaries. That's 6 races. And did they vote in at least 4 of those 6? So they're within the 90 to 100 range. They voted within at least 4 of those 6. And I created a very small list, because I mean, those are, if you voted in primaries and generals repeatedly, that's a special kind of voter. So we targeted that list to actually go hunt for volunteers. Again, the problem though is, like, that's a list of voters. Volunteers are still a separate. You can have a strong voter. That doesn't necessarily equate to being a